I've always felt inspired by iconic designers like Charles James, and especially his designs of the petal dresses. The wide hips representing the shape of a flower and the accentuated waist always reminded me of the 18th century silhouette. So I was directly drawn to create a combination of the 18th century stays and Charles James' iconic design. This video shows the muslin mock-up, the structure that forms the dress and the delicate work with the velvet, and will give you an inside look into my work. I hope you will enjoy it. I used an existing pattern of my 18th century stays based on a pair of stays from the 1760s and altered it a tiny bit to get some more modern lines. Everything below the waist was cut off and got exchanged with the hip piece formed like a flower facing downwards. I thought about adding a waist seam like the original petal dress had, but decided against it because firstly I only wanted the vertical seams for a cleaner look, and secondly I thought it would take away from the elegance of the hip curve. Sewing a test piece is always one of the most exciting parts of the process for me. It not only shows if the pattern I drafted works out, but it also shows if the vision I had while designing can be transported in the dress itself, or if it maybe only was a nice sketch but does not work out as a garment. So it already is a crucial point right at the beginning of the sewing itself. Seeing this test piece come together assured me that this dress could turn out good. The test piece itself not only looked like I envisioned it, but already held its shape good on its own based on the more sturdier fabric and the position of the seams. I only had a few things to correct, which I felt confident to change on the real piece without another mock-up. With the dress this structured, the first step of sewing the actual dress is to create some sort of skeleton which provides the shape. Even with the mock-up holding its shape on its own, the heavier velvet can't support itself in the same way, so it needs a layer of support. For this I'm using the fabric of an old petticoat. This works perfect since it's lightweight and sturdy at the same time. Marking the seam allowance, I try to be as precise as possible since this makes the sewing a lot easier. I'm only adding seam allowance on the side seams, leaving the neckline and the bottom without any. Making sure I set up my sewing machine to match the seam allowance, I can now simply lay both pieces on top of each other and sew them without having to pin anything. After ironing the seams open, I can then cut the boning and shape it to match the shape of the seams. This way it will be the smoothest when the whole piece is sewn together. I decided to add a zipper in the back of the structured piece because this way it's possible to close it smoothly, even with the flower-shaped part at the bottom not laying flat to the body. With all the seams and the zipper boned, I could mark the places where I wanted additional boning on the petal parts. I had a general idea where to place the boning, but I only added one at a time, put it back on the mannequin and looked where the next boning was necessary. That's because I didn't want to use too much reinforcement so the garment wouldn't get too stiff. I also reinforced the neckline with a strip of the same fabric to make sure it would hold its shape. Usually no one sees this part of the dress. A whole day of work of altering the pattern, cutting the fabric, shaping the boning, sewing, and so on. Later only visible through the shape it gives the dress. Just a subtle reminder of the work that went into it. For my personal projects, I like to use fabric I already have in my stash, so every material that's used in this dress I already had on hand. For the lining I had to use 2 different colors since I didn't have enough of the red one, and I wanted to use it on the bottom part since it could be visible from the outside. The top part of the lining will be in a lighter color then. Again, I made sure to cut the pattern pieces out precisely so that while sewing I didn't have to use pins. After sewing both bottom and top parts separately, I added the label to the center front. To create accurate corners, I find it easier to only sew the sides one at a time, pull the threads to the back and tie them there. This trick helps a lot, especially on slippery fabric. With both parts ready, I sewed them onto the structured part to hold them in place on the top and on the bottom. The middle is held down by an additional waistband and the sides at the zipper are sewn in by hand. After this, it's time for the velvet. To prepare the piece as best as possible, I determine the direction of the fabric and make sure the pattern is laid out following it. Marking the seam allowance with chalk works best for me, since I don't need a lot of pressure and this way the fabric won't shift as much. I'm again measuring out the seam allowance as accurate as possible. You may want to use a wider one with this fabric, since it tends to fray a lot. The key for smooth seams for me is trusting the pattern and getting to know the fabric. Having a good drafted pattern means your pattern pieces will fit to each other. Most times while drafting a pattern, both sides of the seam have the same length. So even if one side may be curved, which means the seam allowance may be shorter or longer, the line where you are going to sew should be the same length on both parts. So when these lines are on top of each other while sewing, both pieces will fit to each other. To make sure they do lay over one another, the next step is to take the fabric and see how it behaves. In this case, using velvet, the fabric likes to move a lot. So I keep that in mind while matching the lines to sew on. Usually, I will lay both pieces on top of each other and try out in which direction the pieces like to shift. With this in mind, I will pin them together slightly off, so while sewing they will rearrange themselves on their own. This takes some time to figure out, but in the end works really nice. To work with velvet, there are a few other things I do to ensure a good seam. I like to use a bigger stitch while sewing, and when pressing the seams I will always do this using another piece of velvet underneath. With almost no pressure while ironing, this will lead to nice pressed seams without destroying the velvet. With all the pieces sewn together, it is now time to attach the outer layer to the rest. The bottom got sewn to a piping made out of the same fabric. This was then folded over the bottom edge of the shaping layer and sewed down using the hem of the red lining. The neckline was folded over and tacked down. This way I achieved a softer neckline than it would have been with a seam at the top, for example. The edge got covered with a ribbon, the back opening tacked down at the zipper, and with that, the bodice of the little red flower dress was done. I didn't film the making of the skirt, since it was a simple skirt made out of 3 velvet panels that got hemmed and tightly pleated by hand at the top. Adding this to the bodice, we are left with the finished dress. I'm always excited when I think about the fact that this dress was once just a pile of fabric and that it only became this as a result of a series of steps. I hope you enjoyed this look into my work as it is right now. It was a great pleasure to show you part of my life, and if you liked it, I'm sure there are a lot more things to show.